We'll talk about this in more detail with Alexei Levchenta. The Russian journalist is on the line with us. Hello.
Yes, good morning.
The question of mobilization. How acute is it right now in the Russian Federation, considering that the Russian army is suffering colossal losses on the front line, on the line of contact?
The shadow of mobilization is indeed becoming more and more distinct and increasingly alarming in Russian society. That is, we are seeing more and more, both formally preparatory measures and, in general, discussions about this topic. People have started to Google this question more actively. People are preparing. Some people are discussing that they need to leave Russia for the period of September to October before the borders are closed. Well, other options. Indeed, it's as if Russian society is really preparing, not preparing with enthusiasm, but people are thinking about how to avoid it. But one must understand that mobilization remains an extremely undesirable scenario for the Kremlin regardless. It is a forced situation if it happens. Therefore, if there's any option to avoid mobilization or to actually carry it out in some hidden form, like a hybrid form, yes, that is, drafting a small number of people, say, mobilizing them over the course of a month. Well, right now, the need is for 30, maybe 40,000 contract soldiers a month. Accordingly, if they don't reach that number, then to make up the difference, the part they are missing, they would use mobilized personnel, that is, reservists, and in this way make the process not very noticeable, first of all, and secondly, not very sensitive. So such an option does exist. Of course, this is not the scenario where 500,000 people are called up at once, which would cause anxiety levels to spike sharply in Europe and everywhere else. But one must understand that calling up 500,000 people, or even 300,000, as was the case in October 2022, is precisely that extremely risky scenario which threatens a serious political crisis.
Regarding the fact that 2/3 of Russian regions have already increased payments to recruiters for contract soldiers, the Moscow Times reports on this. And the reward grew the most by approximately 10 times in the Smolensk region, from 115,000 to 1 million rubles. And the region also increased payments to contract soldiers from over 1.5 million to 2 million rubles. And payments were also raised by traditionally poor regions. These are the Samara, Ryazan, Saratov, Irkutsk, Kaliningrad, and Kemerovo regions, and the Altai Republic. In 38 out of 56 regions, rewards for recruitment for the war are provided for by official regional and municipal programs and are enshrined in government decrees, gubernatorial orders, and directives of executive authorities. And in 18 regions, payments are handled privately through, let's say, recruitment agencies. Over the years of the war, nearly 100,000 advertising organizations have already been created in Russia, under the guise of which army recruiters often operate. How effective are these methods? And considering the declining economy of the Russian Federation, how long-term are these payments?
The trend of increasing payments to contract soldiers has been around for quite some time. Many regions have reached the maximum limits of their capabilities. It is clear that the payments to recruitment companies are still somewhat smaller than those to the contract soldiers themselves. Therefore, this is a way to try and provide further stimulation, yes, as if by giving additional incentives, so to speak, to their agents who will be looking for new people. But of course, generally speaking, for many regions, the situation is already at its limit, and many more, to be more precise, 2/3 of regional budgets are currently in a deep deficit, a deficit the likes of which we haven't seen, perhaps, since, well, maybe August 2008 or September when the global crisis hit. There were serious problems back then, yes. But since then, nothing like this has been observed in Russia, and the problems are indeed mounting in this regard. And so there is a limit to increasing all these payments.
What do you think, Alexei, now that we see Ukraine intensifying strikes on the Russian economy as a whole and on wildberries? And on other important economic elements. We hear about oil refineries every day now, and Ukraine will intensify its strikes. In other words, strategically, Ukraine is no longer the same as it was in 2022. And we can see along the front line that over the last 2 months, the Russian occupiers haven't had any significant territorial gains. Regarding what Miroshnik is saying about the strategic plan, thinking about a long-term war in strategic terms, what could this indicate overall, besides mobilization?
Putin is facing a serious dilemma. On one hand, ending the war in the current reality would mean that de facto he has lost this campaign. Well, that's already fairly obvious because the goals that were there initially, that is, to remove the Kiev regime, to bring under control, to replace, or rather to change the government that is in place for a regime of his own, which was personified there by Medvedchuk, he failed to achieve all of that in the first few days. But he can't really get out of this situation. He can't say that he has spent colossal resources. The war has been going on for 4 years, and as a result, the main asset there is Kostyanivka, which they haven't even fully taken yet, right? That would mean he is admitting his defeat. Well, that's how he perceives it, so he can't agree to that. So what options does he have then? Well, either ramp it up or escalate or continue all this in a sluggish mode like now. Well, sorta, yeah, sluggish. Meaning without carrying out any escalation measures like mobilization and so on, or declaring some kind of second front. And so for now, he is trying to go to act inertially. And this protracted war, it sort of gives him the opportunity to continue existing in the same mode. But here, one must understand that, again, resources are not infinite. That is, the problems are mounting, economic problems are mounting quite seriously, although relatively slowly. And so it might seem that it's all not that critical. And so there is this dilemma, right? Either continue all this until the moment you can continue in this mode, or escalate.
And the fact that the RF, that they are preparing a covert mobilization of 800,000 people in the RF, Russian media are also writing about this and are emphasizing that they are already compiling lists of potential participants in the so-called SMO. And those evading contracts are being searched for, and those who end up on the lists may have the issuance of their international passports blocked. After the elections, they actually plan to start working on them without an official declaration of mobilization. And I would also like to remind you that at the beginning of July, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov confirmed that Russia intends to continue the war against Ukraine until the demands voiced by Putin earlier are met, which, well, essentially boil down to the capitulation of Ukraine. In other words, no one is going to stop, and they are currently preparing resources in every way possible for some other kind of covert mobilization. You noted, Alexei, that everyone is already interested in how to leave for a short time. But will it work? Or will they make it in time? Because the lists are already, as they say, everyone has been put on notice. How do you assess the situation with subsequent mobilization? Is such a number really needed for the so-called special military operation?
Look, so practically speaking, yes. To leave, you need to leave sometime. Well, either before the Duma elections, before September 20th, or at most a week after. So it's obvious that this time frame exists. So after the Duma elections take place, for a few days, no one will announce mobilization. But after that, the risks increase exponentially. Yeah, of course, you have to look at the current situation. That's regarding whether people will manage to leave in time. Yeah. And if they don't make it in time, then you have to understand that we don't know. Well, everything will depend on the form in which it is carried out and how serious its scale actually turns out to be. Because the more sensitive this is for people, the greater the probability that those who, accordingly, didn't manage to leave but don't want to fight will resist in one way or another. And in reality, they won't really have anything to lose because you'll either die at the front, right? Or, well, what's the threat if you're there? Prison? Or you're threatened with death from resisting, right? Well, I mean, the choice there won't be very big in that sense. Therefore, resistance from some portion of the people is quite likely, and that'll be a problem. Will mobilizing 500,000 people solve the problem at the front for Putin? Well, that's kind of the next question. And it's probably more for military experts. Yeah, I suppose. Well, military experts believe it won't solve it because modern drone warfare leads to a situation where even that many people will simply perish at the front within a certain amount of time because drones don't let them through. They don't allow for any significant advancement.
What do you think could be a red line for Putin when it comes to ending the war against Ukraine?
Well, it's obvious that the red line for him is his removal from the presidency. If that were to somehow happen, that would be the red line. Everything else for him is, at most, just putting the conflict on pause. But he is in an existential confrontation with the West, with the world, so to speak. Therefore, in any case, even if he stops this specific war, he won't stop fighting altogether.
And the fact that in Russia, they now want to remove the only party that opposes the war in Ukraine from the elections. The Supreme Court will consider a lawsuit on Monday regarding the exclusion of the Yabloko political party from the parliamentary elections in September. Isn't that a bit too obvious, right? Because Yabloko is supposedly advocating for an end of the war. There. What kind of political direction, right, is the country taking for the near future? Would they really go that far?
Well, initially, honestly speaking, it was expected that Yabloko wouldn't be registered. So the fact that the Kremlin decided to allow this party to participate came as a bit of a surprise to many. Although it was clear that they had a difficult task. On one hand, they need to demonstrate some legitimacy of the process, and on the other hand, demonstrate that there aren't that many supporters, well, opponents rather, of the authorities and supporters of ending the war. And so Yabloko was registered in a way so that they would get a small percentage of the vote on one hand. On the other hand, they decided to solve a number of other technological tasks. But a few days later, it became clear that Yabloko was attracting a great deal of attention, and indeed, this anti-war wave had become active. Yabloko is accumulating it, even if they don't say anything and aren't going to actively engage in their own party's propaganda, so to speak. In any case, they have already become a symbol of this anti-war resistance. This worries the Kremlin, but as far as we understand, no final decision has been made in their court yet. So all these legal proceedings, they keep them in limbo so that the party itself doesn't radicalize and stays quiet. It's clear that there will be a court hearing there on Monday, even if it doesn't matter what decision is made there, because there will still be an appeal. So this will all drag on for some time. And all this time, the Kremlin can keep this party in limbo and, make them keep their heads down and stay quiet.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexei, for joining us. Alexei Livchenko, a Russian journalist.